Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Audrey Russo here, President and CEO of the Pittsburgh Technology Council. Always happy to be here, and today is no exception. Really excited to have a conversation with my guest and a colleague, and I'll introduce Skip Newberry in just a moment. Thank you go out to Huntington Bank for their belief in us right at the onset of COVID and always through every experiment that we have. And they've been good partners through the entire pandemic and beyond. So if you don't know them, get to know them. Also want to give a shout out to Jonathan Kirsting. He's joining us as always. He's Vice President of Marketing and Media and Storytelling. And he's joining us to make sure that we're paying attention to the chat and facilitating a conversation. We've muted you, and we've done that on purpose, and I will apologize in advance because of my dogs. And hopefully they won't misbehave today. And we also are using this as an opportunity not to share your wares and sell your services, but really just as an opportunity to do a dive with our guest. So we love Portland. Portland loves Pittsburgh. There's lots of commonalities in both of the cities, and there's lots of differences. So the only way that we can be prosperous in Pittsburgh is to have relationships outside of Pittsburgh, because that's what matters and that's what makes it work. The Technology Association of Oregon is who we are going to be talking to, the CEO, and that's Skip Newberry, who I've known for a few years. And he's been doing some tremendous work in Portland, and I think it's important for us to know what's happening outside of Pittsburgh. So I'm going to introduce Skip Newberry, friend and colleague, and someone who's stirring up good trouble in the state of Oregon and based out of Portland. So I want to thank you for taking the time with us today. And hopefully some of our people who are listening will see that the importance of building these kinds of relationships. So what would be really great is for you to talk about Skip, sort of like, who is Skip the man? And then we're going to, how did you get into this job? How did you get to Portland? And let's talk about we'll talk a little bit about TECNA and just sort of the relationships there as well. So let's talk about Skip the man.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here, and always enjoy opportunities to kind of share best practices and talk about what's going on in our respective regions. I'll also, take note of your requirement that I not pitch any of your members on how great it is to be in Portland, Oregon. So no selling of our wares or.
Oh, you can. Services. You're allowed to. You can. Let's see how good you are. Let's see how good you are.
Yeah, so a little bit about me. Let's see. Originally from the Northeast, so from Connecticut and in Boston. Spent some time there early in my career. Was originally an attorney. Did corporate and IP work. Yeah, recovering attorney. Shocking.
I never knew that. Okay.
Yeah, cool. And then ended up with a company that was entering kind of a growth stage after an early startup run, and they needed some corporate upkeep and some cleanup. And we ended up launching a company that we spun out. I ended up running that. That brought me west, as did my now current wife, who was from Bend, Oregon, and we met in law school. So she gave me the ultimatum, and that coincided with an opportunity to open a Bay Area office. I convinced the team in Boston I could do it from Portland, and that was in 2005 that I made the trip out, and was at first one of those people who was traveling a ton for work, and never really spent a lot of time in Portland the first couple of years. And then I started to look around, and I was like, wow, this place has a lot of really interesting raw materials of what you'd consider to be a tech hub. And couldn't help but observing that, with the right kind of dots being connected, the place could really kind of explode in a good way. And so I had an opportunity after getting involved in a couple different startups and kind of going through the ups and downs of those, some more successful than others, had a chance to join the city of Portland, where I was serving as an economic development advisor to the mayor. This was in 08-11, so during the last recession. Mm-hmm. And had a chance to contribute to the development of a software and tech strategy for the region. And during that time, helped launch the Portland Seed Fund, which was a public-private seed fund, one of the first of its kind in terms of that structure in the US. Did some stuff around open data following on data.gov during the Obama administration, and then also some work around procurement reform and looking at some different ways to kind of incentivize open source software development within the city along those lines. And so that got me on the radar of what was then the Software Association of Oregon.
Right.
And the board of directors said, hey, would you ever consider a nonprofit turnaround? I said no at first, zero nonprofit experience. And eventually I said yes, and the rest is history. And that was almost 9 years ago. So I've been doing this work ever since.
That's great. So you also were the past chair of TECNA. Can you just
Yep.
talk about that so people know how we all have that kind of relationship with this TECNA organization?
Yes. So Technology Councils of North America, it's an international group that kind of knits together all the regional independent tech associations across the US and Canada. And it's a great way for us to kind of share best practices, do common projects, collaborate on policy. And I know that when I first took this job, I was given advice from my counterpart in Seattle at the time, who said, this is a weird occupation. It's unlike anything you've ever done. And there's a lot of great people doing this. So no sense reinventing the wheel. Join this organization, learn what people who have come before you are doing, and take their ideas and then adopt them for your own market. So TECNA has been really great over the years. I think it's got a ton of upside and unrealized potential still, especially as we think about multi-state policy issues and collaboration there, and a lot of politics being grassroots and local. TECNA really serves the local regions and exists to strengthen them, and there's some real power in that model.
That's great. No, you did a really good job sort of pulling that together. So thank you for your leadership over and above just doing your daily work.
Thank you.
And so let's talk about Portland. Let's talk about the tech scene in Portland. Give us some of the snapshots of, however you slice the data or however you want to talk about it.
Yeah. So we're much smaller than Seattle, but growing, and that's been true for the last, I'd say, decade or so. Very much a B2B SaaS software hub. In more recent years, it used to be that we were known as Silicon Forest, mainly because of the presence of Intel, one of the largest facilities in the world there, about 22,000 employees, and then of course their entire supplier network, mainly based around semiconductors and devices. And then in the, I would say, last probably 15 years, it shifted to more embedded software, open source software, then mobile took off. And then now we've got a lot of different types of diversity as it relates to software. Less so on the consumer side, more so B2B. And, you have New Relic, with their engineering headquarters there, and Navex Global, a very large ethics compliance software company. A lot of these companies are not like national brands that you know of, but they're quite large and kind of under the radar. And then we have a lot of startups. So there's a lot of dynamism in the market. One criticism is that we have a lot of early stage companies get acquired too early. But what that has resulted in at least the last 8 years or so, is a lot more investment from larger companies that have served as go-to-market partners for those startups that are now pumping more resources into these R&D hubs that exist in the area. So we have a lot of product, a lot of R&D and engineering, which has been an element of resilience that we've enjoyed in this latest downturn, because people are investing in product and doubling down on that during the COVID situation.
Right. And so what about healthcare? What about innovation in healthcare? Are you seeing that? Because most cities now, that's their number one employer. So what are you seeing there?
Yeah, I would say that in terms of the healthcare sector, we take a broad view of it. And so we actually look at like the fact that Nike's headquartered there and Adidas North America and the athletic and outdoor industry. And a lot of what they're focused on is preventative health and wellness. And then we have a lot of hospital systems that are quite large. And so we do a lot of work with their product and innovation and digital teams there, because a lot of their focus is really around sort of the consumerization of healthcare, if you will, and how do you engage consumers on a day-to-day basis. Well, Nike and Adidas do that really well. And so there's this cross-pollination and convergence happening in the local market. And we're seeing a ton of startup activity around digital health companies. There's also Oregon Health and Science University, which has really benefited from investments from Phil Knight, the founder of Nike, as well as Gert Boyle, the founder of Columbia Sportswear, focused on cancer research. And so that's created a whole set of sort of big data related companies, AI and ML on the software side of things. So that's an area that's like I think it's our number 2 employer, healthcare is, outside of the public sector in the state. And that's a growth area for us for sure.
And so, it's interesting because Pittsburgh, we have some similarities because we are mostly B2B and we do a lot of amazing work that's not necessarily sexy or name brand. We've had a proliferation of autonomy and robots, which I don't know exists in Portland or not, but we definitely have a deep footprint there. Are you seeing particularly over these last 9 months, are you seeing movement of people that are moving to Portland in the same pattern that has been occurring over the last 5 years?
Some changes there. So historically, we've been sort of a net importer of highly educated people from all over the rest of the US. And we don't have a tier 1 research university that we enjoy. We have some smaller ones, some kind of punch above their weight in narrow areas, like Oregon State University is really good in robotics, but small by comparison to anything that Pittsburgh's doing. And so what we're seeing is there's been a bit of a drop off, some cooling, if you will, since March, in interest in Portland from some folks in terms of it's not the same acceleration or growth year over year in terms of people moving to Portland. It's slowed a bit. It's not negative, but it's definitely slowed a bit. And I think part of that's COVID. A big part of it is also the perception of Portland since protests and some of the unrest that occurred this summer.
Okay. I didn't even think about that. That's true. And so what percentage, do you know what percentage of the workforce is actually working in tech or tech related jobs?
Yeah, so it's actually a small percentage. It's single digits. So we're not even double digits in terms of the sort of overall employment in the state. Huge contribution to GDP though, like massive.
Right.
And so in terms of productivity, it's incredibly efficient as a sector. And we also pay a ton in taxes. Compared to Arizona, the tech industry in Portland pays almost double.
Wow. Okay, so yeah, I mean, that's probably where the similarities stop then, right? Not just the weather, et cetera. So sort of the actual demographic is very, very different. You have a lot of outdoor activities and you've got a lot of tie to that. So I would imagine there is a proliferation of innovation going on there. And you also have some companies that are more in the newer economy that have massive presence there. So we're sort of at the inverse of that, right? Because you have a lot of the older industry that's sitting here too. But there still are a lot of commonalities in terms of the issues. What are the biggest issues that in terms of Oregon that the Tech Council works on, like in terms of advocacy and public policy? And then we can talk about, the TECNA role.
Yeah, so one of the big issues we've been working on the last couple of years is data privacy. And I think that's pretty consistent in most states. Like California and other states, Oregon's Attorney General is looking at CCPA out of California, the failed Washington bill that didn't quite get across the finish line last session, and trying to see timing wise what makes the most sense. So about a week ago, she decided 2022 is when she's going to look towards some comprehensive legislation, which could allow for Washington to go first and then Oregon to follow suit and either align or improve upon it. Most states, including Oregon, recognize CCPA in California has some flaws, and so we don't want to replicate that wholesale. But with the lack of federal guidance or legislation, I think states feel compelled politically to do something. And so we'll be also involved with a contact tracing effort, a smaller bill in 2021 related to data privacy. I serve on a data privacy task force that the AG put together about 2 years ago, and we're continuing to do work on these two pieces of legislation. Apart from that, we've been involved in some stuff this past summer that kind of brings us a little bit far afield from where we've typically operated in terms of policy. And one area that's kind of interesting is we had a number of members in the Portland area really feel like they had to do something relative to their employee resource groups who were Black. And so with their Black employees, they said, hey, we're feeling unsafe. There's a legitimate issue with respect to how police have treated us and sort of what's going on downtown with some of the protests and even in our neighborhoods. And so the companies and their execs, instead of doing a top-down sort of approach to policy, what they did was they essentially said, okay, to the employee resource groups, what would you recommend we do? What position would you recommend we take? And over the course of a weekend, we ended up with about 40 or so companies kind of coming in under the TAO umbrella, where we worked really over 48 hours to craft a series of letters to federal, state, and local officials that were capturing as much as possible the recommendations of the employee resource group. So we had to look for some areas of collaboration or sort of synergy across all of the different companies' groups, and then consolidate that into a letter that the companies could get behind. And remarkably, it came together. And so we were able to submit this letter that called for police reform, and it was something that I think caught a lot of elected officials somewhat by surprise, which, having an industry sector step up in the way we did, it added an unusual voice to who were primarily just the, typical advocacy groups. And so that was, I think, an interesting sort of effort from my standpoint, having done advocacy for a long time now in this role. It was the first time I can honestly say that companies really flipped the model and looked at sort of this emerging stakeholder capitalism framework, which is that execs really need to be thinking about how they're relating to their employees and also to their customers and the broader public. And so there's much more porousness there and much more influence that some of these groups have on decisions of the C-suite.
Wow, and you did that all in the summer during COVID.
Yep.
And right after the murder of George Floyd.
George Floyd.
Great. So that, I think there's a question here from someone. Oh, it's wonderful. Bill is saying it's wonderful. Thank you. Great advocacy. So are there any other trends that you've seen, both positive and negative during COVID?
Yeah, I would say that one thing we've seen is, apart from the protests, there have been other examples of kind of government either not doing enough or kind of doing the wrong thing, quote unquote, as it relates to cultivating more of a business-friendly environment here in the state. I wouldn't say that Oregon necessarily has a reputation elsewhere in the country as like the business-friendliest place, right? To begin with. And so what we've seen now is that with COVID, there's been in some parts some more attention to economic development issues and how do we come out of this with a strong recovery. But on the other hand, you look at some of the legislation that's been passed by elected officials this year, or even attempted to be passed, and it shows the opposite. So we have a metro regional government that tried to pass a wage tax on businesses and then exempted itself from its application. It was one of the first ballot measures that was actually defeated in the last, 10, 15 years. I mean, that's how bad it had to be. Usually our ballot initiatives, no matter how crazy they are, pass. And this one was, handily defeated. But that was one example. And then we also had some efforts around facial recognition bans at the city of Portland level, which, we ended up staying neutral on because the idea of banning facial recognition for a short period of time, essentially a moratorium in effect, fine, that's a reasonable effort, as long as we have some clear sort of guidelines around sort of what testing is going to occur in the interim, and then like how things could potentially be implemented if certain criteria are met. So a lot of that wasn't defined and still needs to be defined. And I think one of the issues there was that if the main concern is how data is used, take the time to regulate how data is used, not the technology itself, because facial recognition technology is one among dozens of technologies that can be used to collect data and that data can be used in a variety of different ways.
Mm.
So it was a little bit opportunistic and not necessarily as quote unquote serious policy effort. And
Right.
so there was some concern around that as well, and how Portland was perceived in terms of anti-tech as a result. But we're working with the city now, which is a largely new city council in place
Right.
too as of November, to try and figure out what's the best approach forward with regard to data governance and data privacy, and much more measured approach.
Yeah, that's good. That's good stuff. We had to work really hard here to make sure that people weren't being left behind, particularly as schools closed.
Yep.
And we got massive attention on our food shortage
Mm,
and people who don't have access to food. So we really got involved early on to try to make sure that people had access to
yep.
the internet, food, to et cetera. So I didn't know if you were struggling with similar issues as
Yeah,
well.
digital divide has come up as well. We have a great organization locally that we partner with called Free Geek. And I know they have chapters or variations in a variety of cities.
Oh, that's nice.
And what they
Okay.
do is they take devices from a donation standpoint, and they also train people to fix them, and then get them into the hands of folks who need those devices, computers, et cetera, mobile devices. And that's been really helpful in terms of doing donations and then getting those to schools or school districts that are in need. A big one has been connectivity as well. So it's devices, it's networks like broadband and wireless, and then it's also the training, because often people haven't had to rely on the internet to the extent that they now do in COVID for government services, job opportunities, education, health.
Right.
So there's also this training element, and it's proved to be a pretty vexing issue, I think, that requires a lot more resources than elected officials anticipated.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's switch for a second and talk about economic development and for venture capital, for example. You talked about a proliferation of startups and in an array of areas, particularly B2B and SaaS. But tell us about investment. How has that
Yep.
been going? Is it
Yeah, I would say that, like, when I first started this work, we were that was our number one issue. Like, oh, Oregon, we're a flyover state was the term used. Like the
right?
VCs are flying from like Silicon Valley to Seattle and back again, and forgetting about Oregon. I would say that changed about 10 years ago. And the last 5 years, it's been really great for the most part. Um, we are seeing, though, that there's been some drying up of an abundance of capital at the early stages. And so as we see this huge growth in startup activity, like since February, we had a record year at the association where we added 178 new member companies year to date, and a good portion of those were startups. And
Nice.
so this explosion of startup activity is awesome on the one hand, but then we're seeing it kind of converge with this trend of, well, it's raining dollars in Austin and in Salt
Right.
Lake, but in Portland, not so much. And so
Right.
that poses a bit of an issue, especially as these companies get into 2021 and their cash starts to, dry up. The runway's not as
Right.
long. So we're watching that really closely. And Series A dollars and later are generally there. We're seeing a lot of interest still from VCs and other funds around the country in Portland, but there's a little bit of a cooling. I mean, we're hearing some conversations in recent conversations with investors that they're like, how business friendly is it really there? And how much does the public sector have its act together? And frankly, with
Right.
an early stage company, you're putting risk capital to work. The last thing you need is more risk that's outside of your control. Like, are they going to pass some other crazy piece of legislation or a tax that's going to help hurt us, in recruiting talent? And that's a legitimate concern right now.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. We're hearing that in what we would call second tier cities as well.
Yep.
And tell us though, you have Nike and Intel, which I'm very envious of, not just because of their work, but the B2C piece of it. What impact do they actually have on the economy?
Yep.
And in terms of even investors and incubators?
Yeah, I would say that on the one hand, both companies have been doing quite a bit when it comes to diversifying their workforces, and this is over many years, like pre-June and pre-George Floyd.
Right.
And so what's interesting is they're major brands. They can recruit and attract talent from all over the world, and that's been something that our region has really benefited from. is that awareness and the sexiness of those two companies.
Right.
They can bring in people. And oftentimes people are like, okay, this has been fun at a large company, 2 to 3 years in. I love the region, want to stay. I'm going to look for an interesting startup or growth stage company. And so it's been a great source of talent for a lot of the emerging companies in the region. And so in a sense, it served as, in many respects, what tier 1 research universities do for other markets where they're bringing in talent from all over the world. Some of these larger, sexier companies have done the same for Oregon.
Right, like what we have
Yep.
in Carnegie Mellon, right? But people come from all over the world, but we're still at the federal level very active in terms of the immigration issues and the
Yep.
changes that have happened over time. And that affects our region as well, because people want to stay and then they can't due to the barriers. So what are you doing to attract talent? What's your message to the world?
Yeah. So one is we have geographic proximity, which is interesting. We're still relatively inexpensive compared to Seattle, the Bay Area, LA. So if you want to be on the West Coast, it's a nice place to be. There's an abundance of quality of life amenities as well. And I think access to environmental assets has been a real boon to folks, especially during COVID. So we're still seeing a big in-migration from California and other points in the West. Talking to our local utility CIO, he said that they're seeing a ton of new housing starts as well in the area, which is good. But it's a lot of people who are coming in as expats, having either made money or working remotely for other companies, which is kind of good. But then when you think about, from an economic development strategy standpoint, for a long time, companies have been investing where the talent is concentrating and where the talent is going to, which is great. But I think in this remote work environment, as more companies can hire people and leave them wherever they are, what does that mean for an economic development strategy for a region? I think it opens a lot of interesting questions.
And that's what we grapple with now. I mean, we've had our growth and our surge, and our GDP contribution in terms of tech is large, as well as the number of jobs. But now is, how do you make it a destination where people really want to live? And Portland has access to a lot of beautiful amenities and a lot of outdoor culture. So one would think that would be attractive. So I'm always interested in trying to understand what a place like Portland is actually doing.
Yeah, really, it's working in partnership with our travel agencies to promote the area and the quality of life. And now our challenge as an association is, how do we promote kind of the business successes alongside that to get them as more well-known? Like ZoomInfo's IPO in the region this summer was huge for us. It was a really, really great sort of marker, if you will. But Bend, Oregon is booming right now. And it's becoming this like new Boulder, with people coming in from all over, especially California though.
Wow. It's beautiful there too. It's beautiful there. So and Bill Frace is saying he just talked to someone in Bend who calls the people emigrating their Zoomers. That's fun. That's sort of funny.
It's like a Zoom town.
Funny. So the way that I look at our relationship, Skip, is that there are people in Pittsburgh who probably want to reach out to customers that are in Portland and or anywhere in Oregon. And I would encourage anyone to look at the the association that Skip leads, because it's all of Oregon. It's not just Portland, even though he's based there, and see if there are ways that we could leverage, those relationships. They're a membership organization just like us, but they're partners, and they're very committed to building the ecosystem. And you've been a great leader, Skip, when it comes to your role at TECNA and at the national level, and the issues that address all of us at the federal level, because we can't forget that.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And, you were one of the first people that I met early on that your wisdom, I remember we had a walk at one of the CEO retreats where you're like, here's everything you need to know. I really appreciated it.
Yeah, I probably would say something a little different these days, right? But it's good to see your face. I love Portland. I think that, COVID has definitely given Portland some different kind of exposure, but, we're all in this in many ways together. and the talent issues that you face are talent issues that we face as well. And people come in pairs, as you well know, so sometimes it's even trickier to figure that stuff out. But we both live in beautiful regions of the world, and there's lots to do. So my hat's off. If anyone wants to reach out to Skip, he's really easy to find. And, we put his website up out there, and hopefully we can figure out some ways that we can continue to collaborate. It's not that far, even though it seems like it is. I don't even think Jonathan, did we ever have a direct flight to Portland? We had a direct flight to Seattle, right?
We took it. It was fun.
And you took it.
Take it again. And I want to go down to Portland and hang out with you guys. It's going to be awesome.
So we need to work on that direct flight.
How far is the drive to Portland from Seattle?
It's about 3 hours.
It's about 3 hours. It's a 3-hour drive. Okay.
35-minute flight.
Right. But I mean, it's a nice, easy 3-hour drive. And then where else? You're close to Bend and where else? Vancouver?
Yeah, and even the Bay Area. I mean, a lot of people live in Portland and commute to the Bay Area. It's about an hour and 25-minute flight.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's, someone else is saying people in Western New York call folks who visit there from Pittsburgh mup ears. Do you know what that means, Jonathan?
What was the?
That because burgers say we come up here. Oy, oy, oy.
Mup
Thank you,
ears.
Dave DeMace. Thank you so much for that wisdom. Skip, I hope you stay safe. Is Portland shut down for COVID?
Yes, we're in a 4-week pause right now.
You're in a 4-week pause. So that means you will be safe and your people are working remotely, and hopefully you'll have a break for Thanksgiving.
Yes, and a happy Thanksgiving to everyone on this call in Pittsburgh as well.
Okay, well, thank you. It was great seeing you, Skip.
Likewise.
Everyone, we won't be back until Monday. We're taking Tuesday.
We come back with City of Asylum.
We're coming back on Tuesday. We're taking a long break, everyone. This is the longest we've ever had. So thanks for everyone for joining us. Thank you, Skip Newberry, again, who joined us from Portland. And everyone, stay safe, stay far away, and just realize one day we will see light at the end of this. So thanks again. Take care.
Thank you.
Hey guys.